I want you to imagine for a moment that you're a Christian in early 1500s Germany, and you're simply trying to attend church. And when you get to the service that day, the priest, when he is celebrating the Eucharist and you're receiving communion, he only allows you to receive the bread. He reserves for himself the bread and the cup. And you know that the bishop of your region is deeply uninterested in spiritual matters. They've only come into that position because they purchased it from a relative. And now you're beginning to hear rumors of a friar traveling around selling forgiveness to fund a new church facility in Rome. He's promising that in this financial exchange known as an indulgence, that you can know you have forgiveness from God and you can purchase forgiveness for deceased relatives. His slogan, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Now, what do you think about all this? Is this right? Is this wrong? If it's wrong, why is it wrong? And how you communicate why it's wrong. What other theological conclusions could that lead to downstream? Now, hold the thought for a moment, because this is the first in a series of videos exploring Jesus's commandment to let your good works shine that we find in the Sermon on the Mount, and how some Christians have come to view good works with skepticism instead. In this series, we're going to look at least 4 pivotal moments in more recent church history that have really shaped Christians' relationship to good works in the modern era. In this video series, it's going to assume that you already believe that good works and justice are a calling for Christians. If that's not something that you're settled in or something that you're wanting to explore more, I highly recommend a series that I have linked into the description of this video where I've taught on that subject. Go ahead and maybe just start there and then hop back into this video, because we're going to assume you're already on board. Christians are called to do good works, and we're called to be a people of justice. Now, let's jump back to about 500 years ago, because it's the first pivotal movement that we need to explore in this series. It's the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. It's a difficult time in church history, to be sure. And the opening question I pose, what do you think about all this? Is what you see around you in the church of that time period, is it right? Is it wrong? And if it's wrong, why is it wrong? How would you respond in that moment? That there's the grace of God. It's being withheld from the laity. It's being used for personal power, and it's being wielded transactionally for financial gain. One of the many ways that you could respond might be similar to the way that a German monk responded named Martin Luther. Luther was a critic of this system of religious works that he saw in the world around him, and all these additional requirements that people were putting in place on top of God's grace. And he was getting tired of it. He was growing frustrated from what he saw as a system created by man that was keeping God's grace at a distance. So in 1517, he famously posted what's been called the 95 Thesis, meaning there was 95 topics that he would like to formally and publicly discuss with someone and to debate. One of those is Thesis 27. This is how he communicated. They preach only human doctrines who say that as soon as the money clinks in the money chest, the soul flies out of purgatory. Now, interestingly, leaders of Martin Luther's day, instead of engaging with this thesis and having the public discussion and debating the merits, instead they wielded politics and power, and Martin Luther was excommunicated from the Catholic Church in 1521. Now, this all accelerated his concerns about the use of indulgences and the misuse of church power, and it kind of hardened his personal positions on certain matters. And so a full breakdown of the Protestant Reformation is definitely outside the scope of what we're trying to do in this video. And I'm in a little bit of danger of oversimplifying what is a extraordinarily complicated issue. But I think it's safe to say that in this moment, Luther was correctly responding to things that needed to be reformed. In fact, we see this even within the Catholic Church. Within a few decades, they have their own counter-reformation that culminates in the Council of Trent in 1563, where they did a lot of hard work to get some of these issues settled. And so this relationship between human works and the faith that we need to have that truly saves us, in Martin Luther's day, it definitely needed clarifying. What does it mean to have saving faith? And there's kind of 2 dials that are in view here. The first dial that we could turn all the way to 11, or we could turn all the way down to 0, is the idea of belief. like the things that I adhere to, the things that I think and hold to be true. And then the other dial that we could turn is much more the dial we could call good works, faith in action. And so in Martin Luther's day, what you saw is that the dial on works was turned way up, and the dial on belief and saving faith had been turned way down. And so this relationship was really cloudy in his day. Like, what does it mean to have a faith that saves? It's also true, despite all of that, that Martin Luther had an appropriate problem he was trying to solve, and he diagnosed the problem correctly. It's also true that extremes often lead to extremes. Solution that Martin Luther brought to the table was, well, if turning one dial all the way down and the other dial all the way up is wrong, well, why don't we reverse it? Why don't we turn works all the way down and belief all the way up? It's a position that he summarized as sola fide, or by faith alone, that we are saved simply by the things that we believe, emphasizing salvation by God's grace apart from any human work. Now, Luther deeply needed this reminder for himself, that we cannot save ourselves. He once said as a monk that if anyone could be saved by living a monkish life, it was me. And yet he had spent most of his life driving himself crazy, feeling far in distance from God, that no matter what he did, he would never measure up, that Luther was a man in need of God's grace. And his system that he gave us and put in place was a system that reminded us of the depth of God's grace, that we are saved not because of anything that we can do, but because God chooses to do what is necessary for us in Jesus. That is beautiful. It is the gospel. It is the good news. But in Martin Luther's articulation, he did separate into two distinct categories, this idea of living faith and this idea of good works. Because after all, we're saved not off of our works, but what Jesus has done for you, not anything that we can do for ourselves. And there is a lot of truth to this and a needed reminder, especially in Luther's historical period. But in the estimation of many more modern scholars, this articulation of the relationship between faith that saves and good works creates an unnecessary division between the two. Extremes lead to extremes. A position where belief is turned all the way down and works is all the way up became a position where works are turned all the way down and belief is turned all the way up. But what if, instead of downplaying the role of good works, that we should instead see these things as necessary to one another? See, Luther, to clarify, he definitely believed that Christians should be known as people of good works and should do good works. He would often say, we're saved by faith alone, but faith never appears alone. But this separation meant that what he meant by faith is that faith is simply a mental exercise. It's something I think, it's something I believe. And 500 years downstream from that, we see this unnecessary skepticism towards good works. That even if it wasn't what he and other early reformers were intending, we can see that many Christians today are skeptical towards good works. We say things like, hey, you're not trying to earn your salvation by doing that thing, are you? Stop hiding behind your good works and just receive God's unmerited love for you. As a preacher, I have felt this a lot. I can't really expect or urge people to do Christian stuff because I don't want them to get confused that what is saving them is what Jesus has done for them. They don't save themselves, and so I can't expect people to do Christian stuff because I have to keep the distinction between being a Christian and doing Christian stuff. Being a Christian is separate from doing Christian things. Christianity in this paradigm isn't a way of life. It isn't an embodied reality. It's just mental assent. It's a thought that I subscribe to. So if I think certain things, then I can be saved. That is what makes me a Christian. And so then in many circles, good works become seen as a potential danger. We can get lost in them. We can somehow stop placing our full trust in Jesus and believing that we're saved by faith alone. It can lead to an overemphasis of certain aspects of the Christian journey, like Bible study and church attendance and prayer, and greatly downplaying and underemphasizing other parts of the Christian journey, like service to the poor, acts of justice. What if the better path and the better solution to the problem that Luther was trying to solve is harmonizing and integrating faith and works? What if it's actually impossible to separate the two? I'm not the first person who's thought this. We can go all the way back to the biblical writer, James. James deeply believed that faith and works were integrated. Here's the way he says it in the 2nd chapter of his letter. If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, be warmed, be filled," yet you do not give them what's necessary for their body, what use is that? In the same way, faith also, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. Notice for a moment how James sees faith and works as deeply interconnected. Faith by itself, in his estimation, is dead. If it's not a living, active, embodied reality, it isn't a faith that has the power to save. You might mentally subscribe to a series of theological doctrines, but without an embodiment of those doctrines, you are dead. I mean, his example here couldn't be any more practical. Imagine a brother or sister, someone in your church community that doesn't have enough. They don't have the bare necessities. And if you can't connect the dots between my faith in Jesus in meeting their needs so that they can have enough, that's a form of faith, but it's not the faith of Jesus. He goes on in his letter to even double down on this. You believe God is one. You do well. The demons also believe this and shudder. But are you willing to acknowledge, you foolish person, that faith without works is useless? You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. So just to re-clarify for a moment, James isn't saying that you can earn your salvation. He's just communicating the process of which we go through for Christ to save us. That saving faith is something that you cannot separate from thinking, from living. It's something that we do together. It's an embodied type of faith. He talks about how you can have good doctrine. He says, so what? Even demons have good doctrine. Now that's a pretty extreme example to think about. The difference between the two, demons and someone with saving faith, isn't what they think, it's how they live out the doctrine that they believe. The role of grace becomes a provider of helping us raise to the occasion of living out the calling of Christian living and providing forgiveness for the ways that all of us are going to fail to meet up to that standard. Grace is not a framework to enable us to separate mental assent from Christian living. Instead, it enables the embodied reality of being a Christian. This makes a lot of sense if you think about it. I have a son who loves to wrestle. And I can say, I love my son. I can say, being a present dad is a good thing. I can say wrestling is good. It helps our kids learn their own limits and learn empathy. And I can go through all the research on that. I can believe all those things. But if time and time again, when I come home from work and my son's like, Dad, let's wrestle, and I ignore him, and I never wrestle with him, and I don't engage with him, anyone in the world would look at me and say, you don't really love your son. You don't really believe that being a present dad is important. You don't really believe that wrestling is a good exercise. There's a disconnect. And this is what James is getting at. This is just common sense, that if you really believe those things, then we would see it in the way that you're living your life. It would be an embodied reality. And without that embodied reality, whatever you say you love, it is a lifeless love. Now, this will probably be no surprise. Martin Luther and his system, he did not like James. In fact, in 1522, when he was writing his opening remarks to a translation that he had put together of the New Testament in German, he wrote a little note to the reader at the beginning saying that James is an epistle of straw because it concerns, in his estimation, nothing of the gospel. He definitely preferred writers like John, most of Peter, but he especially loved Paul. But that raises like an interesting question, right? Is James really out of step with those other writers? Does James contradict Paul? Some actually think so, but maybe they're speaking to different audiences and maybe they're actually just answering different questions. Maybe Paul was answering first century questions and Luther was trying to answer 16th century questions. We're actually going to look at that in our next video, trying to see, diving into the debate of how we can make sense of the New Testament in a whole and what the other writers have to say about the role of works in our salvation. And it's a debate that's still shaping how Christians see good works today. But here's my hope for this video today. My hope for this is to just take some steps and maybe compelling you and others that you might share this video with to more deeply think about integrating their faith in their everyday life, to hopefully help reveal why we've gotten here and how certain groups have come to believe certain things about good works, to help maybe you navigate what it looks like to have a more life-giving practice of your faith, to feel a little bit of freedom, that you don't have to be skeptical of good works. Jesus told us, go let your light shine. That you don't have to be afraid of living a life that is motivated by things like justice and serving the poor, that these things aren't opposites of the Christian faith. They're actually like central to the Christian faith. That a faith that is mental only, that's not expressed in living, is probably not a faith that's saving. A right practice that I want to invite you into is just to simply read James chapter 2. We've looked at a portion of it today, but just read through it and just ask yourself, what's the clear, plain meaning of what I'm reading? What is James trying to say in this teaching? And then to ask, how will I live differently in light of this portion of Scripture? What are you being called to? Don't rush it. Go slow as you read through James chapter 2. My experience is when I would come to James, I would have this voice in the back of my head. I would read him, and James would say something, and I'd say, oh yeah, James, but don't you know? And what I've begun to realize about myself is that as I was reading James, I'm importing a view from outside of the Bible into the Bible and trying to tell James how he needs to adjust his theology instead of James telling me how I need to adjust my theology, importing an outside position that found its origins 500 years ago and forcing it onto this chapter until it can fit into the outside paradigm I'm imposing on it. Instead, may James expand our categories and help us see the centrality of being a people of good works in the role of our faith. And Lord willing, I'll be back soon with the next installment of this series, and we'll dive into the debate of James and Paul. God bless. Hey, if you enjoyed that video and you have a moment, why not watch another one?